Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to NCITE Presents. This is an occasional series that shows our research, talks about pressing issues, and discusses the threat environment and other matters. Today, we have a very important topic to address. Sadly, it's pretty timely. It's on vicarious trauma and on building resilience in our counterterrorism research and workforce communities, but frankly, in the broader community as well. My name is Erin Grace, and I will be today's moderator MC. I want to welcome our online audience. We have a lot of government folks from many federal agencies on, so welcome. Know that this is being recorded, so if any of your friends and colleagues miss it, we're going to be sharing out that recording. Very excited to introduce you to a slate of bright light for what promises to be a timely, impactful 75-minute discussion. Following this event, our in-person audience is invited to join us for a reception downstairs, so please stick around so that you can mix and mingle and meet each other, which is also part of resilience building. In our Omaha audience today, I'm proud that we have with us UNO students and faculty, staff of NCITE. I see law enforcement there in the back, so Sarpy County, Omaha Police, hello, and thank you for coming. We have our industry partner Splunk here, also the Jewish Federation here. And so obviously this is an issue of broad importance, and FBI. Wade didn't mean to leave you out, so FBI is in the house. I want to also let you know about a couple events we have coming up. So please mark your calendars. We have penciled in an event on protecting faith-based communities on October 27th. We also have an event November 1st featuring New York Police Department's top counterterrorism officials. So this is Rebecca Weiner. So you can find out about these events on our website, unomaha.edu/NCITE, or on our QR code. Also, this is a time in which UNO is fundraising, and NCITE certainly is part of that. So these community engagement opportunities are very important. We are fundraising for that on our website. It's part of UNO's Wear Black, Give Back. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Kathy Pettit. She's the Dean of Students and Associate Vice Chancellor. She's also part of this Division of Student Life and Wellbeing that is co-sponsoring this with us, because obviously resilience is much bigger than give a few words.
Well, thank you very much for coming today, not only for all of you who are present in this room, but for everyone that we have online. This is an incredibly important topic at a crucial moment in our global history. And I know nothing better than great minds coming together to see what we can do together. Resiliency is something that I've really dedicated my professional life to. This is my 25th year at the university. I've been a mental health therapist since 1995, and it isn't always. We know prior to COVID that we were seeing a significant increase in both the volume and, more importantly, acuity of mental health issues facing not only campus, but in our communities. COVID only exacerbated that. And so people are fond of saying if it's the COVID effect, it was happening prior. And there's many of you know who are doing research, you know that we were seeing these dark trends. At the same time, what has really happened that is challenging is that we lost mental health therapists in droves during COVID, left the field entirely. So we are now faced with increased mental health needs, everything that's going on in our world, and we're losing those very practitioners that have the wisdom and the voice to help make a difference. We've got to figure out a way to take care of ourselves. I have a couple of my directors here in the audience, and I hope they will confirm that almost every day I say we are the Division of Student Life and Wellbeing, but well-being starts with us. If we do not take care of ourselves and support ourselves, we cannot do the work for our students. And it's hard when you're in a giving professional, whether you're police, FBI, a researcher, you have passion to make a difference. And it isn't always focused on taking care of ourselves. And so this is critical to talk about this and how we support one another. None of us are immune. If you'll allow me just to share a couple of things. I grew up with a father who was a psychiatrist. Twice in my childhood, we had to have special protection at the house because of a particular subset of individuals he was working with, burned in my memory. But it didn't scare me away from mental health. And then about 8 years into my practice, I had a client that threatened me and my family. And thanks to Google Maps, knew where I lived. I had to step away from the profession for a year. And did a lot of work and a lot of connecting, like this event is providing, to recalibrate and how am I going to do this work going forward, better protecting myself, better protecting my family, because vicarious trauma doesn't just affect us, it affects our families. So I can't emphasize enough how important and timely this conversation is. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to a really rich conversation.
We have NCITE Director Gina Ligon. She is an internationally recognized terrorism expert, and her expertise on that subject will be shown locally in Omaha at 7 a.m. and then nationally on CNN Sunday night. But I want to let you know that she has a big, big interest in workforce development as in the thrust of what we do here. So with that, Gina.
Hi, everyone. So I, like Kathy, was raised by a clinical psychologist. In our family, mental health was the same as physical health. And so just like you get a flu shot, you have to take care of your brain. It's another organ. And it's just health. It's all health and protecting yourself. And so I was very fortunate to grow up with not knowing the difference between mental health and physical health. And so when we got the question from one of the researchers in our consortium about what resources are available to help some of these IT students who we've recruited to work on our counterterrorism project about racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, I went to look, and our sister center in the UK, CREST, had done a really wonderful project on trauma and looking at sort of vicarious materials like we're going to talk about today, but that was really about it for this niche of research. And so we decided with our program manager, Dana Sachs, who's here today from Department of Homeland Security, to issue a request for proposals on this topic, because we thought, let's get some really great researchers in the community to open up their research chops to be able to help us all understand how to protect ourselves. And so that's who you're going to hear from today. So I wanted you all to know how this was inspired, and it was inspired by you and by wanting to protect our students who are working here at NCITE, by wanting to protect the workforce who we are all doing research to support, the Wades and the Kevins of the world, and to make sure that we are giving you our very best to keep you in this profession as long as possible. We've kind of named this part of our research as protecting the protectors, right? And so you are our protectors in the national security workforce, local security workforce. And so what can we do? Panel is, I wanted to have someone who would be symbolic of who these protectors are. Then Ph.D. Durall came to mind, and this is because she is the executive director of the National Counterterrorism Center in the Washington, D.C. area. So CC has had a 30-year career in national security, not only at NCTC, but also at the Defense Intelligence Agency, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and FBI. And so she has had this storied career of protecting Americans and trying to help us all be safe. And now she's in a leadership role. And she is very passionate about protecting her workforce and helping them to be resilient and to be able to do the difficult work that keeps us all safe at night. So with that, I would like to welcome our keynote speaker to the stage, Ms. Durall. Thank you.
It's my honor to be here with you today to kick off this panel on resilience and counterterrorism research and practice. We at the National Counterterrorism Center have an important mission, one where years of successful counterterrorism pressure and the sophistication of what we have built post 9/11 means that we've reached a transition point out of a counterterrorism-led national security. We recognize counterterrorism as a foundational capability. Thus, the expertise and collaboration skills we developed in countering terrorism are being leveraged for other national security threats. The collaborative relationship between NCTC and NCITE is beneficial in support of that mission because it deepens our collective counterterrorism insight, boosts NCTC's warning capabilities, explores emerging paths for terrorism innovation, fills gaps in best practices, and draws on resources. We would not have been as successful in mitigating the threat since 9/11 if it weren't for our people and their dedication to mission. That being said, the work we do can and does take a toll on our workforce. And we have the responsibility to foster a psychologically safe workplace with purposeful work opportunities for continuous learning and growth, and the autonomy to contribute. As it relates to resilience and an officer's well-being, we offer health and wellness activities, programs, and events, including time for physical and mental wellness, on-site gym, guided meditation, and access to mental health professionals through our employee assistance program. As leaders in the intelligence community, we have a special responsibility to be calm. We can't add to the crisis. We must navigate through it, especially in the high stakes. I need to instill in my team the confidence that I'm going to be there to promote and support their efforts and enable them to innovate. As counterterrorism professionals, our job is to share information with partners across the counterterrorism enterprise and drive whole of government action to secure our national counterterrorism objectives. Therefore, I role model how to be resilient, persevere through obstacles, be open and adaptive to the changing environment, being inclusive and empathetic with each other as we attain our objectives and keep the nation safe. Investing in our people is at the forefront of our minds. We have 4 core values at ODNI and in the counterterrorism center. Excellence. We lead boldly and act decisively. Courage. We speak truth to power. We consider all aspects of risk. We innovate, imagine, seek, and pursue new possibilities. 3, respect. We act in humility, seeking candid opinions and embracing differences of thought. And for integrity. We protect and defend the Constitution and comply with the laws of the United States. We are honest, ethical, and trustworthy, and we act in objective and unbiased ways. Due to the nature of our work, we're not able to share a lot with with the folks outside. You need to trust your colleagues, in some circumstances with your lungs. Credibility is often not solely about your knowledge base, but also about the way you interact with your peers. As I mentioned earlier, our core values of respect and integrity are critical to our culture and success in keeping the nation safe. Leaders must create a welcoming and supportive environment for all those who share our mission and our people need a set of reliable tools and methods to respond to evolving threats. To succeed, counterterrorism professionals also will need to retain the agility, expertise, and tools to disrupt global terrorist threats as tactics and trade practical. Our counterterrorism architecture will need to remain nimble to quickly identify new threats and overcome the challenges of that allow space for terrorists to operate. This includes developing and maintaining a diverse, resilient, and adaptive workforce. Building and sustaining a diverse, resilient, adaptive, and talented workforce is a mission imperative for addressing the challenges we face. To quote Director of National Intelligence Avro Haynes, to provide strategic advantage to policymakers and warfighters, we need to understand the world, which is constantly evolving and more connected than ever. Building an IC workforce made up of people who think differently, see problems differently, and overcome challenges differently is a prerequisite for success. True diversity and inclusion, greater innovation and success. That's a particularly compelling argument for the IC, where it's critical to finding and developing novel ways to solve tough problems. It's also a competitive edge we have over our adversaries that don't value diversity the way we do. NCITE emulates that concept in its multidisciplinary research approach. Before we transition to the panel to dive deeper into resilience, I will leave you with these parting thoughts and quotes. Everyone brings their own talent, gifts, and passion to the world because of their unique life experiences. I believe that diversity is what makes our nation great and distinctive from our nation. As for the two quotes, the first to inspire you from one of our former First Ladies, Lady Bird Johnson. Let your reach, your grasp always, and make your little plot in this world greener because you walk. The second quote, for your own self-care, Dr. Seuss. Be who you are and say how you feel. Because those who mind don't matter, and those who matter don't. Thank you for having me over these last 2 days. I really look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, CC, for those wise words. She'd be a great boss, wouldn't she? She knows a lot about resilience. So we're going to have our panel take their places. While they do, let me just tell you how it's going to go. We've all been to panels where people talk too long. We want this to be really engaging. We want you to ask questions. And so I've asked our panelists, who are brilliant and could spend the whole hour filling you with their wisdom, to keep it to 10 minutes apiece. So they're going to tell you about their bios. You can read them for yourself in the programs. Come on up, guys. And then we're just going to get going from there with what I hope will be engaging Q&A. The reason we have community partners here again is that this subject is not just limited to this field. It's really, we're going to start there, of course, but they have a lot of good things to tell you and all of it. But here from that. So we'd like to start with Daisy Muibu. Daisy is at the Africa Center at the Department of Defense. She'll be a little bit about her work.
Can you all hear me? Wonderful. Thank you so much for having us today. So yes, I am not at the back. Can you hear me now? I'm just going to talk really loud in case it goes off again. So yes, I am Dr. Daisy Muibu. I am at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, but today I'm here on my own behalf. So whatever I say should not be attributed to the Department of Defense or to the Africa Center, but to me. So with all that aside, I do want to state that, thank you again for the introduction, and that I come here as part of a broader interdisciplinary team that is composed of psychologists, criminologists, and political scientists. And so we, at all different stages of our careers, we provide a unique perspective on this matter. So when Dr. Joe Young, who's the other co-PI of this project, as he and I was conceiving of this plan to conduct this study, we really started looking at it from our own personal experiences as researchers, right? we both study very similar phenomenon in that we both study terrorism and political violence, but the way that we go about it is rather different. And as a result, we are sort of indirectly exposed to different violent materials. So Dr. Young, for his part, works a lot with a lot of data sets, at times having to come across certain violent content such as images and videos, and also rhetoric online. I, on the other hand, most of my work has involved field work in areas such as southern Somalia that have experienced prolonged periods of conflict and that are considered to be at high risk of violence. So we recognize that though we haven't directly experienced violence ourselves, we are indirectly exposed to different types of violence and that this may have impacted us in different ways. Now, what Dr. Crayne and colleague Dr. Shortland have done is going to elucidate a lot more on what researchers such as myself have experienced. But when Joe and I were talking about our experiences, it naturally made us think about practitioners, right? How do practitioners, how are they affected by indirect exposure to violent material? Right, I think we know a little bit, or we know actually a lot about how practitioners are impacted by direct violence in terms of them developing PTSD symptoms, but how about indirect exposure? So this led us to think about the question of, how, can such indirect exposure lead practitioners to develop symptoms related to vicarious trauma? Now, the concept of vicarious trauma was originally developed to explain certain adverse reactions that clinicians experience by talking to people who are recounting their own traumatic events. And much of the literature on vicarious trauma is still focused a lot on clinicians and mental health practitioners, but in recent periods, we've started seeing that expand to include military, some law enforcement, social workers, and even first responders. I wanted to argue that counterterrorism practitioners, as diverse as they are from civilians who work in government and non-government agencies, as well as folks in law enforcement, folks in the intelligence field, in military as well, that these people by definition are exposed to various different types of violent material and should actually be studied. So this was the motivation. So this led us to conceive of this question that is really at the heart of our work, which is how are counterterrorism practitioners affected by indirect exposure to violent material? And our goal over this first year of funding and moving forward was to develop a baseline understanding of how exposure to such indirect materials affects them and identify tools to mitigate its harm. So we conducted a mixed method study. On one hand, we conducted a survey. So far, we have 171 respondents that we have surveyed. And of course, as you can imagine, this is a very difficult population to reach. And for that reason, we've partnered with the McCain Institute out in Arizona to be able to access their practitioner network, which is about 1,000 or more, I think, in this case, of practitioners in the field. And our survey really was trying to examine three things. On the one hand, we tried to understand the exposure. And when we're talking about exposure to this type of violence, we're looking at it in two ways. Are they exposed to different types of violent materials? So everything from images to videos, maybe working with data sets, maybe talking to victims and perpetrators, maybe traveling to locations that are more at risk. So we're interested in the different types of exposure as well as how frequently are they engaging with such material on a day-to-day basis, monthly, maybe even weekly. The second thing our survey really tried to get at is trying to disentangle or distinguish between this idea of vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress. And here we worked with a licensed practitioner, a clinician who gave us a lot of insights in sort of being able to disentangle the two. On the one hand, secondary traumatic stress is when we experience other people's trauma and develop symptoms akin to PTSD. And this is often the result of either a single or several critical events. Whereas vicarious trauma is really just negative cumulative shifts in your work, maybe having low motivation and growing apathy towards from your professional and personal life. But what's really separates it from secondary traumatic stress is that vicarious trauma normally happens progressively. It's after prolonged exposure to violent materials, where secondary traumatic stress will happen if you have a single event that is very critical that occurs or that you hear about. When talking about vicarious trauma, this is more of a prolonged exposure to violent content. And we wanted to be able to distinguish these two forms of trauma from general work chronic stress that some people refer to as burnout. So that was the second thing our survey tried to achieve. The last thing our survey tried to achieve is trying to look at the broader impact such exposure and potentially developing these symptoms of secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma has on your job performance, as well as broader mental health and job satisfaction. So those are the three things our survey tried to achieve. And we then decided, you know what, we're not getting as much as we can from these surveys. We should go ahead and do some interviews. And we reached out to 12 individuals from the backgrounds of military, law enforcement, intelligence, and from a think tank background as well. And here it was really just to dive deeper to try to build some sort of a deeper understanding of how such exposure affects individuals. So let's wrap up with findings, right? And what we found was interesting. From our survey, we weren't surprised that there was people who work in this work would be exposed to violent content. What we found was surprising is that 70% reported to be exposed to 6 or more different kinds of violent material in the course of their work. So yes, they're exposed, but they're exposed to various different types of materials. They're not just working on certain content, but they're exposed to a wide variety of content. Second thing is we found is that over 70% of our initial sample who reported being exposed to violent material reported still to be bothered by that experience. In terms of vicarious trauma symptoms, in terms of the scale that we use to measure vicarious trauma, we noticed that about 25% can be considered to have symptoms that suggest that they are having vicarious trauma or distress associated with vicarious trauma. When it came to secondary traumatic stress, about 17% of samples seem to have either high or severe symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. We also found that vicarious trauma, in terms of vicarious trauma, high exposure to violent content, both in really being exposed to more than 1 or 2 or 3 more types of violent content, as well as being exposed to it more frequently, did increase your chances of developing vicarious trauma symptoms. But this wasn't the case in terms of developing symptoms towards secondary traumatic stress, suggesting that more prolonged exposure rather than having just one, looking at something that is very tragic and has one big impact on you, rather than having one major triggering event, is this slow, everyday, day in, day out exposure that can lead you to have more risk of developing vicarious trauma symptoms. We also found that high levels of both vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress is associated with increased counterproductive work behavior, as well as a decrease in your job satisfaction. And the interviews elucidated the similar thing, right? All of our interviewees were either exposed indirectly or exposed directly to violence in the course of their work, or both. And that was a big concern for us. We also found that most of them reported symptoms of distress, everything from occupational burnout to folks who clearly had morally injurious experiences in the course of their work, and that impacted them later on in terms of depression or feeling a need to shift in their careers. Interestingly, and this is where I think some of the work that my colleagues will bring up here really matters, is we found a protective factor that came out of the interview, this idea of having value-laden work. This idea that you feel that the work that you're doing really closely ties to your own personal values, and you feel that, even though I'm exposed to a lot of violent content as a course of my work, some folks even who had experienced direct violence against them or threats of violence against them, because they felt such a closeness to their work and belief that they were doing something right, this really helped them feel, sort of protect them against developing these symptoms. So what I want to close off of is sort of wrapping up, talking about sort of the 3 key things that we've taken away from this study. One is that, yes, we're not surprised that counterterrorism practitioners, the whole diversity of the population in this workforce are exposed to violent materials. But what did surprise us is that how many of them are exposed to multiple different types of violent materials. So like 6 or more different types of violent materials. And then secondly is that this exposure, both in terms of the frequency with which you're exposed to violent content, as well as the multiple different types of violent content that you're exposed to, does lead to more vicarious trauma symptoms rather than secondary traumatic stress, suggesting that it is this prolonged day in, day out exposure that is something that we need to be concerned about, as well as not just the major, jarring images that we can automatically get that would cause you to have some traumatic responses. And then lastly is that, developing these symptoms of vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress does indeed affect work performance in terms of leading to counterproductive work behavior, which is something that I'm sure we all care about, but also has its knock-on effects on mental health and general job satisfaction, which is really important if we're trying to maintain a resilient workforce with very little attrition rate to people the line of work. We have next steps that I can certainly take at Q&A, but I'm hoping I can do the 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blanchard.
I love what you said about the surprise of the quantity, that idea that it may not be the big thing that everybody expects, but it's the drip, drip, drip of the daily exposure. And I'm sure our friends in law enforcement in the back can relate to that. So thank you. Next up is Dr. Emil Shortland of the University of Massachusetts Lowell.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for having me on this panel. It's a real privilege to be able to talk about this project, to talk about our work with Matt, alongside you, Bailey. So, my background is a forensic psychologist, and one of the main areas that I've focused on for a very long time, alongside a portfolio of security research, is kind of the idea of human performance, decision-making, and optimization. And almost by accident within that, I found myself developing an interest in various forms of trauma that come from people having to do very, very difficult jobs in very, very difficult environments in which they are forced to face unbearable difficulties. And so for me, it's always been a real interest in how we support those individuals, how we study those individuals. And I was very lucky that I came to that area of research around the time that the conversation of the type of trauma, I think, really began to gain some nuance and some development to it. So when I started doing a lot of my work with the military, moral injury was really starting to gather some steam, and I'm very lucky I live in Boston, Massachusetts, which is where Dr. Brett Litz is also based, and he was the individual who published the first paper on moral injury. So I've always had an interest in the various forms of trauma, diversifying or thinking beyond, in a military population at least, PTSD, and thinking about the way that the experiences people have can, even if it's not direct, that's one of the big things about moral injury, is the observation, even if it's not a direct experience, people can still suffer adversely from that. Or examples I gave earlier was in the military domain, there was a kind of an early idea that drone pilots could get trauma because they were watching it on a screen. We now know that that isn't true, and we know that that is a psychologically traumatic experience. One of the other areas that I really got to bring to bear in this project was my two personal experiences. But my first ever piece of work as a young master's student was working alongside the Public Protection Unit, which does the identification, prioritization, and intervention with individuals who are looking at indecent images of children online. That is again a very extreme domain of content material to be viewing. I unfortunately had to view a lot of it myself for the project, and being alongside a lot of the individuals who were looking at that kind of material for hours and hours and hours. And really, my first ever experience left me with an understanding that it is really quite difficult sometimes to do the job that we have to do, to research the things that we have to research. But at least with that project, the immense good that came from it, the number of high-risk offenders who were arrested because of the researchers who were willing to do the coding, willing to do the science, willing to make a tool, that we can't shy away from doing research in difficult areas. So we as academics, we have a responsibility to understand it and then to help the best that we can. And then finally, as a director of a research center, I've seen my students have to code incel forums, far-right forums, jihadist propaganda, if that's where their project takes them, and speaking to them sometimes and saying, hey, how's that project going that you're doing? And having them look at me and say, I had to stop, I had to change. I had to study something else. And I remember one of them just said, it was too heavy. And so now we're seeing that effect that Daisy mentioned, which is we're losing some of our best sometimes from the areas where we need them the most because of the experience and what they're having to do as part of this research. So when the call came out with the emphasis on workforce development, having already had a lot of conversations with Matt and an interest in moral injury and various forms of traumas, this really felt like an exciting opportunity to really put some systematic science around what can happen when we ask people to engage and immerse themselves and critically have to think about acts and images of some of the most abhorrent acts that humans are capable of committing. I'll talk very briefly about our part of the project, and then I'll obviously defer to Matt to talk about the empirical work that he's been leading. But one of the first things that we needed to do was to try and get a sense of what is out there already that can help us think about this problem. And one of the problems, so we conducted a rapid evidence assessment, and one of the problems that we immediately discovered is that the type of trauma that we are talking about and thinking about here is very, very specific. But the body of work on trauma in general is absolutely gigantic. And so being able to really drill down on the science that specifically taps into what we are talking about and interesting actually was quite a challenge. But the definition that we put in place that I felt conceptualized what we were trying to tap into in this project was looking at cases where people had studied individuals who were exposed to images, events, atrocities, but they themselves were powerless to intervene at that time. And I felt that that was really what a lot of our analysts, a lot of our researchers are doing. They are observing these acts, then be it a conversation about an upcoming attack, be it an attack or an event that's gone by, be it a bombing, be it just an expression of an ideology or a propaganda video or even worse, and not being able to directly intervene in that event. So we really wanted to focus on what is the science around that observation of an atrocity without the power to directly intervene in that moment. Unsurprisingly, there actually wasn't a lot of research on that. There is a lot of research, and again, we did this just after COVID, and there's a lot of really good research on trauma stimulated by the COVID pandemic, on moral injury, on burnout, on secondary traumatic stress. But that specific dimension of it was slightly harder. But we were able to find some good work on indecent images of offenders, officers and their teams, content moderators online, some on drone pilots. And so what we did was we kind of collated or systematically went through all of these pieces and tried to put out a framework of the problem that would help us not just understand the etiology and the risk factors, but I think more to identify the points in the process where we have the greatest opportunity to do good and to create positive change. And so very, very briefly, and I'll end with this and pass over to Matt, but our project basically kind of identified that there are three ways or three dimensions of the exposure to vicarious trauma that we can start to unpack to think about the problem. The first is the material itself. And there are two dimensions of that. Thinking obviously about the nature of the material, the extreme, the level of the material, but things like, is it static? Is it video? How does the content within the material interact with a value that we hold, and then how those values can differ between different individual observers. But also the environment in which people are viewing the material came out in the research being really important. Size of image on the screen, citing some of our studies. Volume, whether the volume was turned on or off. Some people said had made a real difference in how they were able to connect themselves, or specifically, ideally, unconnect themselves for what they were viewing. And then finally, and I think this is a really interesting finding, but it resonates with different pieces of work we've done with medical professionals, was the idea of the material coming as a surprise to someone. And so, you're going through, you may be coding or going through content, and then seeing something that you weren't expecting to see. And that has a really detrimental psychological effect, because there wasn't that period where you could almost make sure that you were ready. So the first bucket is just there is a lot that could be done around the nature of how and what people are looking at. And that can be a really important place to start. The second area is around the organizational culture. And I'm sure we'll talk about this in the Q&A. I know Matt's interviews have touched on a lot of these issues, but around the culture that people are in when they are doing this kind of job. What's the culture? around sharing how they're feeling? Is there a culture of kind of grit up and shut up? And, you know, swallowing your pride or wearing it as a badge of honor. And what's weird is that resonated with me quite strongly, because I remember being in the police, when I was doing the police work, I was young, I felt I was invincible. Neither one of those are still true. I'm well aware of that now. But I also felt that I was just a student, and all of the officers had done this much longer, saw much worse than me. And so I felt that there was a culture that I shouldn't be talking about this, right? So what does the culture feel like? And then on top of things like the resource management came out in our literature review. So what degree of load is someone dealing with when they are then looking at this kind of content? And unsurprisingly, the more they're overloaded, the more they're stressed, the more they're strained, the more the culture is encouraging fast work, high deadlines, whatever it is, the more negative or more likely they are to negatively be affected by the content that they're looking at. And finally, the last piece, and I think it's a really interesting one, and I think probably if I were to think about where I would start my interventions, is just at the level of the individual. There is some, not a lot, but there was some really interesting work around not everyone is equally vulnerable to be impacted. So we vary, right, into individual differences in the degree to which we are going to be adversely affected by what we look at. And we vary at the individual level on what kind of content is going to adversely impact us. There was some work on personality traits that predict that. There's some work on family dynamics, what the home environment is like. One of the findings, kind of people who I think were married and had kids, reported a lower level of suffering than those who didn't. So there's individual level issues. But the other one I thought was really important when it comes to thinking about preventing the problem is what I would kind of call the intra-individual difference, which is that we are not equally vulnerable every single day of the week. Our degree of vulnerability is not static. And so now you get into things kind of like, you know, how well we've slept, how well we've eaten, but each day our degree of vulnerability to what we may be exposed to can change. And so our review, it was kind of the first piece of work that we did, that we put out and was hosted on the website earlier this year, simply just kind of synthesized all of the work that we had found that looked at this idea of the observation of atrocities by individuals who at the time were powerless to intervene. And what we took away is that if you're thinking about this problem, preventing it, improving it, providing resources, there's lots of different intervention points you can target. You can target the individual. You can target helping them protect themselves, helping them think about their mind, their own level of risk, their awareness. We can look at organizational culture, culture of an organization, culture of caring, culture of sharing, and we can look at the material that they're looking at, the way that it is observed, and at any of those levels or levers, we have the potential to try and improve the outcomes of the individuals who are required to do this kind of work. And so that was the first bit of our project. It was a really important piece of work. I was glad we were able to get some quick wins out of this and some early progress. And then I'm very lucky to work with Dr. Matt Crayne here, who then followed on and I think did even more of the detailed job.
Thank you, Dr. Shortland.
When we first met over Zoom, I think you told me one of your individual factors was golf.
Yes. Can I tell that story? Okay, 10-second story. When I did the work with the Public Protection Unit, they told me I needed a healthcare plan to protect myself. And so I said, oh, don't worry, I've got a great idea. I'm going to take up golf. And it's going to make me happy. And I'm going to see my friends every weekend. And the game infuriated me so much. I was never negatively affected because I was always angry at how bad I was at golf. So my first intervention recommendation is just make everyone take up golf and they'll be angry and infuriated. Too distracted. So,
Next up, we have Dr. Matt Crayne, and he is at the State University of New York at Albany.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to NCITE for hosting us and for inviting us to speak on this panel. So, unlike Neil and Daisy, who come from security and forensic psychology backgrounds, security, counterterrorism, this is not my space. I'm an organizational psychologist. My interests are about people's experiences at work, full stop. And in particular, I am very, very focused on the role of values in the context of work. How do the things that we value, how do the things that we believe in impact the choices that we make, what we do, and how we engage in that work and what those experiences are like. And what's interesting about that is that organizational psychology, organizational behavior as a discipline has a lot to say about how we use values to get involved in the things that we do, why we're attracted to different types of work or companies or places we want to be, because we see it as a good fit to the values that we have. But what we don't actually talk about very much at all is that if your values are present in the work that you do, then they're potentially under threat by the work that you do. And when those values are threatened by the content and the context of your work, what does that do to you? How do you experience that? What does that mean? Tangentially to that, when I was in graduate school, I worked under Dr. John Horgan at the International Center for the Study of Terrorism, ICST, where that's where I met Neil originally. And so I've been kind of around this space, and I saw people doing terrorism research and reading and going through propaganda and going through criminal complaints and looking at all this material as part of their jobs. And that's always been something that I understood as an important job, a job that needs to be done, but a job that we don't really understand. It's not a thing that you ask terrorism researchers or counterterrorism practitioners. You never really ask, hey, what is your job? How do you define it? What does it look like? What are those experiences that you're having on a day-to-day basis? What are they? And I think that answering those questions are important. So when NCITE had this call for proposals about interest in the development of the workforce, these two interests for me overlapped, which is this is an important, values-driven, potentially dangerous type of work. Let's ask questions about how those things intersect, right? And what are the experiences that people are having on the job like, and how does that impact them? So our focus, we started our project with a qualitative inquiry, which was myself and our research assistant, Jen Mezpel, who I should absolutely give recognition to. She's done an incredible amount of work on this project. We went out and we solicited interviews, detailed interviews with terrorism researchers and people in the field. And we took an organizational psychology approach to this. In organizational psychology, we have a process that we call job analysis. Job analysis is a structured, detailed way to kind of break down the critical elements that make a job what it is. Right? So you can find defining characteristics that you can then evaluate and measure in the future so that you understand what it takes to do a job well and what the typical experiences are of the people that are on that job. And so that's what we did. So we did over 50 hours of interviews with terrorism researchers at various stages of their career. So everyone from very senior PIs with 10 and 15 and 30 years of experience in the field to undergraduates who had come in as research assistants in the last year or so, thinking that this was a discipline they wanted to be involved in, and everyone in between. We asked them questions about what it takes to do the job, what types of knowledge and skills are required, what it is on a day-to-day basis. What does your work environment look like? Where do you, typically do the things you're doing? Who do you interact with? What is your experience? But we also asked them questions about their personal values. Why are you doing this, right? How did you get involved? What brought you, of all disciplines, of all fields, to terrorism research, political violence? Why are you thinking about it? Why are you spending your time doing this? How do you see this as a reflection of yourself, if you see it as a reflection of yourself? And then within that, what types of experiences are you having on the job that you potentially find distressing or counter to your value set, or things you have to deal with at home and reconcile with yourself about the experiences you've had, the things you've seen, the things you've read? We poked and prodded with these questions because it turns out that most of the time when you ask people these types of questions, they're pretty hesitant, they're pretty reticent to admit that things impact them the way that it probably does. But if you ask just slightly different questions, you get a very different answer. So for example, one of the questions that we asked to all of our interviewees was, to what extent do you feel like the work that you do on a day-to-day basis is distressing or causes you some type of harm? And the overwhelming majority of people gave some answer on it. Doesn't bother me. I can get it. I can do it. It's not a big deal. But if you ask us slightly different questions, which is there anything you do differently in your life as an outcome of the work that you do? Almost universally, people could list all these different behaviors and cognitions and things and actions they've taken that are they're total changes to what they would have done otherwise. If I wasn't doing terrorism research, I would not be doing this thing. A great example is one of our interviewees recounted that her work had been studying the 7/7 bombings. And when we asked her, what do you do differently in your day-to-day life? She said, well, I don't ever take mass transit anymore. She said, should I walk everywhere? I ride a bicycle, but I can't take a bus. I can't take a plane. I just don't even consider it. Those are trauma responses, right? When you're altering your behavior or you're altering your worldview, response to the experiences you're having, those are trauma responses. We don't think about them that way, right? We think about trauma as this bigger, scarier, bloodier idea, right? But the mental and cognitive and behavioral anguish that people go through, changes they make in their lives, are really important, right? So in the research that we've done, we've seen qualitatively coming from this, I think 3 big emerging themes that we've been reporting on. The first is that this work, doing terrorism research, doing counterterrorism practice, is traumatic. It has the potential for trauma, but it is not often recognized as such. Right? There are barriers in the way for people saying and recognizing and acknowledging for themselves that things that they're doing are difficult and the things that they're doing are potentially traumatic and that they are impacted by them. There's lots of reasons for that. For example, people will often say, things might be hard for me, but there's always somebody else that's doing something harder, right? If I work on, domestic right-wing extremism, and that's the research that I do, the things that I might encounter in my research might be really difficult, but the person down the hall works on jihadi terrorism, and the propaganda that that person is working on is more significant in my view as the person than the things that I'm doing. So who am I to complain about the experiences that I'm having when other people have it worse or have it as at least as badly as I do? We've also found that there is this gets to the second theme. The second kind of emerging theme is that there is a cultural element to how the stigma behind talking about this type of trauma, these types of experiences within this discipline, within this field. People are often really unaware that other people are dealing with this, and so they are hesitant to bring it up. There are very few institutional guardrails put in place in a lot of these places to advocate for people to raise their hand and say, I've encountered something or I've experienced something that is traumatic or problematic. And we've also seen that there is kind of almost a prestige seeking or a bravado that comes from the field. So people will, for example, challenge each other to encounter or witness violent material, for example, that they otherwise wouldn't have seen. Right? You go to a conference, you speak to your colleagues, and say, hey, did you see that new that video that was just posted on the Telegram channel? Right? It might have nothing to do with your research, but now you don't see it out because it's part of being in this community. So there are cultural factors that are contributing to the experience that people are having and the inability of the collective group to say, hey, we have to pause and acknowledge that the material that we're working on, the problems that we're working on, potentially put us at risk. And finally, the third kind of emerging theme, and this is something that Jen Mescal is working on really as a focus, is we're starting to see in our qualitative research an emerging identity-based issue here, which is that we are finding that women and racial and ethnic minorities in particular are reporting more variety, I would say, in the types of traumatic exposures that they have and their outcomes from those exposures than men, for the most part. This is, I think, really important, really interesting, because if you think about the types of extremist groups that we do a lot of research on, and we're talking about, ideologies of those groups are very often focused and targeted towards people of minority status, right, or women, or people in the LGBTQ community. When you have those identities and your work is to see hate or challenge towards your identities, yourself literally represented in the propaganda or the atrocities that you're witnessing, it's an additional level of personal identification, personal value attachment with the work that you're doing that I think that we don't anticipate at all, right? People go into this line of work as stoic academics trying to make a scientific contribution, trying to make a contribution to this field. And they don't anticipate just how close they're actually going to be to the material that they encounter when they encounter it. So there is a lot of work to be done, but it starts with, I think, recognizing that these experiences are there and that people are at risk in these places.
I think you all did a good job of sticking to time. This is how it's going to work for the next 20 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to lead them off with a question. I'd like to call Cece Durall back up. She's going to take my spot, and I'm going to kind of talk show host it a little bit, so forgive me for that. Those of you watching online, if you'd like to drop your question in the Q&A, somebody will get it to me by some form of communication here. We'll try to happen it. Those of you in the room, just raise your hand and we'll try to get to you. I know you probably have 1,000 questions like I do. But what I'd like to start off with is something a little hopeful. So a mitigating factor with personal resilience. Cece took a walk today. I read a book about the 1500s after I had to stop, take a break from the news this week. And then something structural that you see either, gaps in organizations, something they could do better, or what they're already doing right. And thank you.
Thank you. One thing I wanted to make sure to come across saying is thank you. Thank you for all of you who showed up today. Thank you to NCITE for investing in this work. Most of all, thank you to all the CT practitioners who have committed their time towards this work. It's invaluable for us. So in terms of your question, though, very mindful, I mentioned that we have a multitude of different resources. Some of the areas where we've invested in is also some meditative practices. And we are fortunate, being in the DC metro area, at least our center is where we have a very beautiful building that we work at, and there's glorious pathways outside. And as Erin mentioned, going for walks is something that's become much more common for our workforce, really breaking away from some of the material and what they're engaging with, sometimes going for walks with colleagues as well. And then one of the things that we're really trying to help our managers, those folks who are observing that are happening in the workplace, is understanding what might be. And a lot of literature and everything that the researchers shared with us today is being mindful of what's going on with your people. So not only watching what's going on with them, and at the same time having the capacity to make sure that you have what you need in terms of being able to manage.
In terms of personal resilience and coping, what we tended to find this last year is that personal resilience did actually have a positive impact in terms of improving individuals' confidence in their work and helping them feel a greater sense of job satisfaction, as well as also helping to mitigate some of the impacts of that care trauma and possibly also secondary traumatic stress. But from our interviews is where we really managed to dive deeper into this. We certainly did find that, just being aware of mental health resources that are made available to you in terms of your organization could have a protective factor. But when we talk to individuals in the interview, we realize that varied wildly between different individuals based on what, the sort of background that they were coming from. In some cases, they just were unaware, right, about what sort of mental health type of support that they were provided beyond sort of what is covered by the insurance. In other cases, maybe they were aware of these mental health resources, but not have seen anyone successfully go through that process and not necessarily carry the stigma of it moving forward. And in some cases, they just were completely unaware. We've been talking to a clinician who is housed within one of these organizations, and her job was to help practitioners sort of work through some of the difficult things that they had been exposed to. And, she noted, aside from sort of the mandatory visits that folks had to come to her for if they were involved in a situation that they had to draw a firearm or something of the sort. In terms of those who voluntarily dropped in, to see them, there was a clear generational gap with younger folks being more open to just coming and, taking advantage of those 15 or so free visits that they could enjoy with her, and whereas older folks just generally did not necessarily want to come through, those who have been in the position for a longer period of time. Also noticed a very interesting thing with some of the folks that we spoke to who had made a career shift. Perhaps they had started in one sort of agency or organization and then moved into another type of position. If they were already in an agency or organization at a particular time when it was seen to be a stigma to come and seek out mental health resources, and then moved into a certain organization or a job that was more open to and more accepting and more encouraging of folks to come and share some of the challenges they're experiencing, they would still carry some of that stigma that they had from before and just not at all seek out those opportunities for themselves. So you can see here very many different opportunities for organizations to step in. We also, also looking at the literature, we realize that organizational support can be so varied, right? It can be anything just by providing insurance that covers mental health to actually being very proactive in providing mindfulness practices and opportunities to see the clinicians on staff. And so there's just this wealth and very broad breadth of different types of organizational support models, everything from peer support groups and mentors such as that. And so perhaps it's also sort of mapping out what works and what does not work, and also acknowledging that that's going to be very individualized, right? Some people have more personal resilience and coping skills that they have adapted for themselves. And for some folks, when we interviewed them and tried to figure out what it is that they do, they did mention, everything from religion as something that really helped, and sort of having a work chaplain that was very useful to folks who went and worked out more. And so it's a very big welcome.
Okay, so I think in terms of the idea of where do we get the hope, I think the hope is all around us, and there is now a much more vigorous awareness of the trauma that we can all suffer, not just specifically in this domain, but I think in all domains. And I was talking at lunch about kind of, psychology enrollments have massively gone up, and it's kind of indicative, I think, that people are suddenly aware of the moment that we've all gone through, what can happen to the human mind if it is pushed to its extremes, and a real interest now in understanding and taking care of ourselves. And I think an extension of that, where I see the most benefit, or where we can quickly get the most benefit, is really reinforcing that resiliency is a fluid construct even within an individual. And it is so tied to just how we basically take care of our body and our mind. And so I do a lot of our other work is on sleep, nutrition. These are fundamental things. Sleeping well, eating well, primes the body and primes resiliency. And being aware of that link, I think, is a really easy and quick way we can just make sure that people know when they are in a state to do something really difficult, and know if they haven't eaten very well, they've had McDonald's for breakfast, and they haven't slept for 3 days, their body is not the same thing it would have been in 3 days' time if they just had some good sleep. In terms of the structural barriers, the one that I keep coming to, and Matt's findings kind of touched upon this, hour distance between a PI and a student, but in research, we are always going into the unknown. When we do data collection, we are jumping into the unknown. We don't know what's on the forum. That's why we're doing the research. We are studying a problem that is often live and unfolding in front of us. I'm studying terrorist propaganda. I don't know what they're going to release in a month's time. I just know it's going to count and be included in my sample. And so when we talk about things like preventing surprise and protecting our people, I think that's quite difficult to think about when we sometimes don't fully grasp the data that we're asking them to grapple with, because either it hasn't been invented yet, or we just don't know the depths and the diversity of it, because that's kind of why we're doing the research. And I think that's just a challenge, but I think it starts with being aware of that and building then in better support networks, knowing that there's a lot of things that people will be exposed to that we haven't considered.
Yeah, I would, just to add to that, I agree with everything that Daisy and Neil have said. And obviously, the fact that we're even, on a hopeful note in general, the fact that we are in this room and on this, having this conversation is a massive step forward, right? I don't know if people who work in this field could imagine that this type of a panel or this type of a discussion would have happened 10 years ago around this topic. So people are talking about it, people are thinking about it, and that is, awareness is a massive first step. I think in terms of a practical intervention, and Neil actually just kind of mentioned the term power distance, right? So one of the things that has come out quite a bit in our qualitative research so far is that one of the biggest barriers to the recognition and support of people who have had traumatic experiences in this work is a disconnect between what supervisors understand the work to be and what people who are doing the most detailed work and encountering the most specific or firsthand accounts of what they're actually experiencing. It's very often, unfortunately, in our reporting, very often that junior, in this case, scholars, people who are academics, junior scholars, junior faculty, postdocs, graduate students, these are folks who are going on the forums, watching and reading propaganda, engaging with the firsthand primary source materials. A lot of times their PIs don't really know exactly what it is that they're doing. They don't even really understand the assignments that they've been given and the possibility or the potential that the assignments that they've been given, because it's a research assignment, could put a person in jeopardy, right? Or could put them in a position where they're exposed to something that they don't anticipate, or they have surprise, or they any of these types of experiences that they can have. And closing that gap is a top-down problem, right? That's a leadership problem. That's a management problem. That's an organizational and institutional culture problem. And that's very solvable, right? That comes from simply understanding when you're in a position of influence or you're in a structural position where you have agency over the assignments and how people work. If you know that this is a potential problem, you can design very quickly, very cheaply, systems to facilitate a bottom-up conversation, to protect people in the materials that they study, and the things that they encounter. That's very actionable. It just comes from recognizing that it's an actual struggle.
Thank you. Are there any audience questions? Maybe you'll have a chance to talk with them after this. Shy? Okay. I want to get your idea about how to thread the needle. I'm thinking about Sharon, who has a son in Israel right now. You know, I'm thinking about all of us watching the news and consuming what's happening. We're not counterterrorism researchers, so people in this room. And so how do you thread the needle between attending to, paying attention to something, or moral obligation to watch, versus taking a break from it? And to your point, something you had said earlier, I think on our call, was the idea that the PI may not know what the grad student is doing, and maybe you said, do they have to? So how to figure out where those guardrails are, how to limit, so that, I don't know if my question makes sense, but how do you have people do their jobs in the safest way possible, or attend to something in the way that keeps us in the game without, burning out or having to fight through strong?
So I think this is the inherent challenge in doing this with this type of work, which is we all know and recognize that doing this type of work, whether it's on the research side or the practice side, is important. This is important. It has to happen. It's a thing that we need, but it also can potentially put people in personal, psychological or even physiological jeopardy, right? So there is no situation where we can say, well, we have to just kind of pack our bags and put this to the side because the workforce is, it's too much, right? We have to develop a way to understand the risks and the potential threats that exist to people doing the work while also protecting them while they do it. That, to me, is back to my statement before, to me, a lot of that is organizational and institutional and structural, which is recognizing that we can't get anywhere to protecting people while they do the work without recognizing that the work has to be done, but also has the potential for challenges in it. By doing that, right, and understanding the details of what types of experiences are likely to happen on the job, what the scope of the types of exposures and the variety of the exposures that the typical person who's doing this work is going to have. Those details, that information allows us, taking it seriously, allows us to develop protective structures, right? And develop institutional policy, develop procedures and guardrails that we can set up internally to the organizations themselves that allow people to do the work as safely as possible. But that is an organizational problem.
Very, very briefly, I think that we need to reinforce that we can't only make it an individual's responsibility to know when they have reached their limit, because either A, they will grossly overemphasize what they think their limit is and how well they can cope, and B, sometimes it's just very, very difficult to know when you are fundamentally being changed by something that you're observing in that moment or long term. And so I think it's really important to educate and build awareness so that not just so we're looking out for ourselves and aware of these costs, but within an organization, within a family, within a community, we are looking out and looking to others and looking out for them, because they may not be in the best position to look out for themselves. Because we know humans are hideous about making judgments, especially about themselves.
I think, to add on to one of my colleagues said, and I agree with everything that they've said, I think it's, ultimately recognizing that this came out a lot from our interviews, is seeing that the people who are most adversely affected by their exposure, whether it was by being exposed indirectly or those who had both indirect and direct exposure to violent content and materials, it's that the ones who are most affected and developed PTSD-like symptoms or vicarious trauma symptoms, who literally just had to leave, who couldn't do things anymore, and you hear very difficult stories of people who couldn't be in good stores and hear something being put down without thinking that something was going to happen to them and having panic attacks. All of them did not have support. That's just the reality. They never articulated having very clear support provided from their organization, and that throughout them recounting sort of the different types of materials that they were impacted with or that they were exposed to. At them recounting sort of the years that they were involved in this work, because most of the individuals had more than a year or more of work in this field, they didn't have that sort of support. It wasn't that organizational the organization sort of interrupting and coming in and saying, okay, fine, maybe you need a break, maybe you need to be rotated elsewhere. They just simply didn't have that. And I think it's an awareness, not just about what exposure they have, but also what institutional support exists. I know over lunch you mentioned something really important, is that, we invested in individuals coming to work for the center and, contribute as part of the workforce, but that there's a responsibility to pour into them, to support them throughout. That we understand that you can do this, but it's okay for you to say, I'm having a hard time, and that it is the duty of supervisors of the organization as a whole to respond to those needs.
Yeah, one of the things that I always keep in mind is there should be no fear of engaging in that conversation, of raising your hand and saying, I need some help. I think there's a term out there, shame, around being concerned about how you're going to be perceived if you're struggling. And one of the things that we talk about with our managers really is about providing that kind of safe space for people to have these conversations. And if you are a manager and don't know how, then that's all infrastructure that we have built over time, certainly reinvested in more as a result of COVID, for sure, in terms of understanding as people were coming back into the workplace, into our structures, how they might take a little bit of time to reintegrate into some of the working rhythm. But just really being mindful of what it might feel like, and also having the right ability to have those kinds of conversations. So I mentioned some of the investments we've made. So not just in terms of our facilities with on-site gyms and meditative practices, but also we have a very strong employee assistance program where it's mental health professionals who are readily available, who can engage in these conversations or can help managers kind of provide that type of support. It's really clear to us that as I mentioned earlier, we have invested in people from the moment in which they raise their hand and they decide to come work with us. And we want to make sure that they don't feel like they're alone as they're trying to contribute, that they're a part of a community, and we're all there to help each other.
I think that's a great note to end on.
get to it after this. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank our online audience for coming. I'm sorry, I saw one of your questions. We'll try to answer that online. I'd like to thank our panel. This has been fantastic. Durall with NCTC, Daisy Muibu, Neil Shortland, and Matt Crayne. Let's give them a round of applause.